Your grandfather bought his first home at 26, 3 bedrooms, a backyard with a fence, a driveway wide enough for 2 cars, a mortgage payment that consumed less than 20% of his monthly income. He wasn't rich, he was average. An average in 1965 was enough to own a piece of land, enough to build equity, enough to pass him something real to his children. Not a lease agreement, not a monthly payment to a faceless corporate landlord, but actual property, an address that belonged to his family. That home, adjusted for inflation, would cost roughly $90,000 today. The median sale price of an American starter home in 2024 is over $300,000. In major metropolitan areas, it is substantially higher. The average first-time buyer needs a down payment that takes the median American household more than a decade to save, assuming they can save it all while paying rents that in many cities consume 40 to 50% of their pre-tax income. The American dream isn't dying from neglect. It is being assassinated, systematically, deliberately, by entities that understand exactly what home ownership means for the middle class and have made a calculated decision that it is more profitable for you to never achieve it. The for sale signs are not turning to sold for families. They are turning to for rent for Wall Street. The pivot. Modern feudalism. The narrative you have been sold is one of supply and shortage. Not enough homes being built. Zoning laws too restrictive. Lumber costs too high. Interest rates too steep. These factors are real. They are not the full story. Between 2020 and 2023, institutional investors, private equity firms, real estate investment trusts, and asset management giants including Blackstone, Invitation Homes, and affiliated entities purchased single-family residential properties across the United States at a scale with no historical precedent. In certain markets, institutional buyers accounted for more than 20% of all home purchases in specific price segments, not luxury properties, entry-level properties, the starter homes that first-time buyers depend on to enter the ownership market. This is not a housing cycle. It is not a supply problem with a market solution emerging on the other side. It is a controlled acquisition, a deliberate, institutionally coordinated transition of the American residential real estate market from a vehicle for middle-class wealth accumulation to a vehicle for institutional cash flow extraction. The goal was never shelter. The goal is permanent rental income from a captive population that has been systematically priced out of the ownership alternative. Economists have a term for an economic system where a small class of asset owners extracts permanent rent from a large class of people with no viable path to ownership. They call it feudalism. The lords have simply replaced their castles with Delaware-registered limited liability companies. Weapon 1, all cash, Fed-subsidized offers. Here is the mechanism that makes competing with institutional buyers structurally impossible for a family using a conventional mortgage. A first-time buyer finds a home listed at $320,000. They have spent 4 years saving a down payment. They have a pre-approval letter from their bank. They submit an offer. On the same day, an institutional buyer submits a competing offer. All cash, no financing contingency, no inspection contingency, closing in 14 days. The seller does not have a meaningful choice. The all-cash offer removes every variable that makes a financed offer uncertain. There is no appraisal risk, no lender condition, no 30 to 45-day closing timeline. The institutional buyer closes faster, more reliably, and with zero financing risk. The family with the pre-approval letter never had a chance. Now understand where the institutional buyer's cash comes from. It comes from access to debt markets at a scale and a cost that no retail buyer can access. The Federal Reserve's decade-plus policy of suppressed interest rates, designed to stimulate economic activity after the 2008 crisis and again after the 2020 pandemic shock, allowed institutional real estate operators to borrow at rates that made bulk residential acquisition extraordinarily profitable. They borrowed cheap. They bought fast. They outcompeted retail buyers not through superior judgment about which homes were valuable, but through structural access to capital that the Fed's policy made available to institutional borrowers at a cost unavailable to the families those buyers were displacing. Redfin data on residential transactions in Sunbelt markets between 2021 and 2023 documented institutional purchase rates in entry-level price segments running 2 to 3 times higher than their historical averages. The markets where institutional buying was most concentrated were the same markets where first-time buyer activity fell most sharply. The correlation is not coincidental. It is mechanical. Weapon 2, rent maximization algorithms. Once the institutional landlord owns the home, the extraction mechanism activates. RealPage is a software company whose products are used by property management firms overseeing millions of rental units across the United States. Its revenue management software, YieldStar, analyzes market data across an entire region and recommends optimal rent pricing for individual properties. In 2022, a ProPublica investigation documented how this software functioned in practice. Property managers using RealPage's system were setting rents based not on what the individual property justified, but on what the algorithm determined the regional market would bear, with the algorithm drawing on data from competitor properties, also using the same system. The result, as documented in the investigation and subsequently examined in Department of Justice antitrust proceedings, was effectively coordinated pricing. Not through explicit communication between competitors, the algorithm handled the coordination, but through a shared software system optimizing rent extraction across entire regional markets simultaneously. A family renting in Phoenix or Atlanta or Charlotte was not paying a rent determined by the individual economics of their specific unit. They were paying a rent determined by an algorithm designed to maximize extraction across every unit in their market, managed by corporate landlords whose scale gave them the ability to absorb vacancies that would force a smaller operator to accept lower rents. The effect on savings accumulation is direct and quantifiable. If a household's rent is kept at the algorithmic maximum, consistently elevated relative to what a competitive market of smaller landlords would produce, the surplus that would otherwise accumulate as a down payment does not accumulate. It transfers monthly to the institutional landlord. The renter cannot save their way out of the rental loop because the algorithm is specifically calibrated to prevent the surplus accumulation that saving requires. This is not market efficiency. It is a mechanism for maintaining permanent rental dependency in a population that would, under competitive market conditions, have the capacity to exit the rental market. Weapon 3, the farmland endowment. The residential acquisition is the visible layer of the strategy. The layer beneath it is the one that reveals the full scope of what is being constructed. The Land Report's annual survey of the largest private landowners in the United States documents a pattern that has been accelerating for over a decade. Bill Gates, through Cascade Investment and affiliated entities, has accumulated approximately 270,000 acres of American farmland, the largest private farmland holding in the country. John Malone, the media and telecommunications mogul, holds over 2 million acres across multiple states. Institutional buyers, including pension funds and private equity vehicles, have been acquiring agricultural land at rates that have driven farmland prices to record levels in major producing regions. The stated rationale varies by buyer: conservation, sustainable agriculture, long-term appreciation, food security. The underlying logic, when examined forensically, is consistent with every other element of this pattern. Agricultural land produces the one commodity that human beings cannot substitute, cannot defer, and cannot eliminate from their consumption, regardless of economic conditions: food. When currency loses its purchasing power, through inflation, through monetary debasement, through the kind of systemic stress that the petrodollar's erosion and central bank balance sheet expansion are beginning to produce, assets anchored to caloric necessity retain their value in ways that paper instruments cannot. And the people accumulating farmland are not making a bet on agriculture as an industry. They are making a bet on food as the ultimate floor beneath any economic scenario. And in a world where the same institutional entities own the homes you rent, the software that determines your rent, and the land that produces your food, the question of who owns the population is answered not by political philosophy, but by property records. The outro, the exit strategy. This is not a call to despair. It is a call to clarity. The playbook being executed against the middle class is not new. It is the oldest property rights strategy in recorded history. Accumulate ownership of necessities, extract permanent rent from the people who require them, and eliminate the affordable path to competitive ownership. Understanding the playbook is the first step to operating outside its assumptions. The middle class was taught to build wealth through institutional savings vehicles. 401ks, index funds, savings accounts denominated in the paper currency that institutional players are quietly exiting. While that advice was being given, the institutions giving it were accumulating land, hard commodities, and real assets whose value is anchored to physical reality rather than monetary policy. The shift required is not complex. It is directional. Away from paper claims on institutional systems toward tangible assets that function independently of those systems. Land, even small parcels in secondary markets, that produces something. Commodities that serve as stores of value outside the fiat casino. Skills that address physical needs that no algorithm can fulfill and no outsourcing arrangement can replace. You do not need their scale to apply their principle. You need their clarity about what actually holds value when the paper stops being trusted. The for sale sign is still visible, but the window for reaching it is narrowing with every quarter of institutional acquisition data that the Land Report and Redfin and the SEC's 13F filings document. The question is not whether the system is designed to keep you renting. It demonstrably is. The question is what you're going to do about it. Subscribe to Economic Chronicles. Stay awake in a sleeping world.